On a cold morning in November of 1978, in the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa, a judge named Harold Steinman looked at the two men standing before him and said something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "Since neither of you can agree on how to divide your father's estate, I have no choice but to order the entire property sold at public auction. The proceeds will be split equally between you." Raymond Addison was 36 years old. His younger brother William was 32. They had grown up together on 480 acres of prime Iowa farmland, worked alongside their father since they were old enough to walk, buried their mother together in 1969, and buried their father together just 8 weeks ago. Now they stood on opposite sides of a courtroom, represented by separate lawyers, unable to look at each other. "Your Honor." Raymond's attorney started to object. "My decision is final." Judge Steinman's voice was tired. He'd seen this before. Families torn apart by land, by money, by the stubborn pride that runs through farming communities like groundwater. "The auction will be held December 15th. The property, equipment, and all assets will be sold as a single lot. I suggest you both use the next few weeks to consider whether this outcome was worth destroying your family." Raymond stormed out of the courtroom without a word. William followed a minute later, through a different door. They would not speak to each other again for 15 years. Now let me tell you how two brothers who once shared everything, a bedroom, a tractor, a future, ended up destroying the very thing they were fighting over. The Addison farm had been in the family since 1892, when Raymond and William's great-grandfather, a Swedish immigrant named Eric Addison, bought 160 acres of raw prairie with money he'd saved working on the railroad. Eric's son expanded it to 320 acres. His son Raymond and William's father, George, added another 160 in 1952, bringing it to the 480 acres that would eventually tear his family apart. George Addison was a careful man. He never borrowed more than he could pay back in a single season. He kept his equipment maintained, his fences tight, his books balanced. When he died in September of 1978, at the age of 68, he left behind a farm that was completely paid off. No mortgage, no liens, no debt of any kind. He also left behind a will that was only 3 sentences long. "I leave all my property to my 2 sons, Raymond and William, to be divided equally between them. I trust them to work it out fairly. They are good boys." That was it. No instructions on how to divide 480 acres. No guidance on who should get the equipment, the farmhouse, the grain bins, just trust. George Addison had trusted his sons to be reasonable. He was wrong. Let me stop here and tell you about these two brothers, because this story only makes sense if you understand who they were and how they became enemies. Raymond was the older brother by 4 years. He was built like his father, tall, broad, slow-moving, methodical. He had taken over most of the field work in his early 20s and considered himself the real farmer of the family. He knew every acre of that land intimately, knew which fields drained well and which held water, knew where the soil was rich and where it was thin. Raymond loved the land. When he thought about the future, he thought about his children working those same fields, his grandchildren, generations stretching forward into time. The land was everything to him. William was different. He was smaller, quicker, more mechanical than agricultural. From the time he was 12, William had been the one who fixed things. When a tractor broke down, when a combine seized up, when any piece of equipment needed repair, William was the one with his hands in the engine. By 1978, William had accumulated a remarkable collection of equipment, much of it rebuilt from salvage. He had a 1965 John Deere 4020 that he'd restored from a burned-out Hulk. He had a 1958 Farmall 560 that he'd bought for scrap and made run better than new. He had tools, parts, welding equipment, a complete machine shop in the barn. William loved the equipment. When he thought about the future, he thought about expanding his repair business, serving farmers throughout the county, building something of his own. The machines were his legacy. For years, this difference hadn't mattered. Raymond worked the fields. William kept the equipment running. They were two halves of a whole, complementary rather than competing. But when their father died, the difference became everything. Now here's where the trouble started. At the kitchen table, 3 days after George Addison's funeral, Raymond sat on one side, William sat on the other. Between them was a pot of cold coffee and a hand-drawn map of the property. "It's simple," Raymond said. "We split the land in half, 240 acres each. You take the north section, I take the south. The farmhouse goes with the south section. Since I've got a family, you can build something on the north section." William shook his head. "I don't want 240 acres. I don't want any acres. I want the equipment. All of it, all of it. The tractors, the combines, the implements, the shop tools, everything. You keep all the land, I keep all the machines." Raymond laughed, a short, harsh sound. "That's not equal, William. The land is worth maybe $1,500 an acre. That's $720,000 total. The equipment is worth what? Maybe $80,000 if you sold everything tomorrow. The equipment is worth more than that. Not to anyone except you." Raymond leaned forward. "Here's what I'll do. I'll give you a quarter of the land, 120 acres plus all the equipment. That's more than fair." "It's not fair at all. You get the farmhouse, you get 360 acres of prime land, you get to keep farming the same way Dad did. I get a chunk of land I don't even want, and equipment I'll have to move somewhere else. How is that fair?" "Then what do you want?" William was quiet for a moment. "I want the farmhouse, the barn, the machine shop, the equipment, and 80 acres around the homestead." Raymond's face went red. "That's the heart of the farm. That's where Great-Grandpa built the first cabin. That's where Mom and Dad lived their whole lives. You want me to just give that up? You asked what I want. That's what I want. Then we don't have anything to talk about." They tried again a week later, and a week after that. Each time, they got further apart instead of closer together. Raymond started talking about what he deserved as the older brother. William started talking about the years of unpaid labor he'd put into the equipment. Old resentments surfaced about who had worked harder, who had sacrificed more, who their father had really loved best. By October, they had stopped talking altogether. By November, they had hired lawyers. And in November, Judge Harold Steinman ordered everything sold. Let me ask you something before we go on. Have you ever been in a fight where you knew, even as you were fighting, that you were making things worse? Where you could see yourself destroying something precious, but you couldn't stop? That was Raymond and William Addison in the fall of 19. They knew they were tearing their family apart. They knew their father would have been heartbroken. They knew the whole county was watching, shaking their heads, whispering about the Addison boys who couldn't even bury their father without turning on each other. But neither one would back down. Neither one would compromise. Neither one would be the first to say, "Maybe I'm wrong." Pride is a poison that kills slowly. By the time you realize you've taken too much, it's already too late. The auction was held on December 15, 1978, a Friday, bitterly cold with a wind that cut through every layer of clothing. The crowd was smaller than the lawyers had expected. Word had spread about the circumstances of the sale, and many farmers felt uncomfortable bidding on a family's misfortune. Others stayed away because the asking price was too high. Land values were near their peak, and 480 acres as a single lot would require deep pockets. Raymond and William both attended, standing on opposite sides of the crowd, not acknowledging each other's existence. Their wives stood with them, Raymond's wife Carol looking angry, William's wife Susan looking like she might cry. The auctioneer started the bidding at $750,000 for the entire property, land, buildings, equipment, everything. Silence. He dropped to 700. Silence. 600,000. Finally, at $500,000, someone raised a hand. The man was in his late 50s, wearing an expensive overcoat that looked out of place among the Carhartts and insulated coveralls. Nobody recognized him. He wasn't from Polk County, or any county nearby. He'd arrived in a black car with Illinois plates, and he hadn't spoken to anyone before the auction started. 500,000 from the gentleman in back. the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 525? No one else bid. 500,000 once. 500,000 twice." Raymond looked across the crowd at William. For just a moment their eyes met, and in that moment Raymond saw what he was feeling reflected back at him, the sudden terrible realization that this was actually happening. Their father's farm, their grandfather's farm, their great-grandfather's farm was about to be sold to a stranger for less than it was worth. Raymond could have bid. He had the money, or could have gotten it. The farm was worth at least $600,000, probably more. If he'd bid $550,000, pushed the stranger up, maybe found a way to buy it himself and work out a deal with William later. But he didn't. He stood there frozen and let it happen. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel came down. To the gentleman in the black coat, for $500,000. The stranger paid in cash, a certified check drawn on a bank in Chicago. He signed the papers that afternoon, took possession of the deed, and drove away without saying a word to anyone. Nobody knew his name. The paperwork listed only a trust, the Lindquist Family Trust, and an address in Chicago that turned out to be a lawyer's office. The Addison farm, 4 generations of work and sacrifice and love, was gone. Now let me tell you what happened to Raymond and William after the auction, because their punishment was just beginning. Raymond took his share of the money, $250,000 minus legal fees, and bought a smaller farm about 30 miles south in Marion County, 180 acres, not as good as the land he'd lost, but enough to keep farming. He worked it for the next 15 years, but he never prospered. The land wasn't as productive. The farm crisis of the 80s hit him hard. By 1990, he was just barely holding on, and every single year, he drove past the old Addison place just to torture himself, to see what the stranger was doing with his family's land. Here's the strange thing. Nothing. The stranger did almost nothing. The fields were rented out to a neighbor who farmed them adequately but without passion. The equipment sat in the barn, maintained but barely used. The farmhouse was occupied by a caretaker, an old woman nobody knew, but the stranger himself was never seen. He paid his taxes, kept the buildings in repair, and otherwise seemed to treat the property like an afterthought. It drove Raymond crazy. All that good land, all that history, being wasted by someone who didn't even live there. William's story was different but equally bitter. He took his $250,000 and moved to Minnesota, as far from Iowa as he could get while still being in the Midwest. He started an equipment repair business which struggled for years before finally becoming modestly successful. He had 2 children, then a divorce, then a second marriage that also ended badly. And he never stopped thinking about the machines he'd lost. The John Deere 4020 he'd rebuilt from nothing. The Farmall 560 that ran like a Swiss watch. The tools his grandfather had used, that he'd planned to pass to his own sons. All of it, sitting in a barn in Iowa, belonging to a stranger who probably didn't even know what they were worth. Neither brother ever spoke of reconciliation. Raymond blamed William for being unreasonable. William blamed Raymond for being greedy. Each of them rewrote history in their own minds until they were the innocent victim and the other was the villain. That's how they lived for 15 years. Bitter, separated, convinced they had been wronged. And then, in March of 1993, the stranger died. The news reached Raymond first. A phone call from a lawyer in Chicago, asking him to come to the county courthouse in Des Moines for the reading of a will. "Whose will?" Raymond asked. "I'm not at liberty to say over the phone, but it concerns property that was once owned by your family." Raymond called his brother for the first time in 15 years. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. "There's a will being read Tuesday in Des Moines. It's about the farm." "I know. I got the same call." "Are you going?" "Yes." "Then I'll see you there." Raymond hung up. His hands were shaking. "Let me set the scene, because what happened in that courthouse changed everything." Raymond and William arrived separately, parked on opposite sides of the lot, walked in through different doors. They sat in the same row but with 3 chairs between them, like strangers on a bus. The lawyer from Chicago was a young man, maybe 35, with an expensive suit and a thick file folder. He waited until everyone was seated, just the 2 brothers and their wives, before he began. "Gentlemen, I represent the estate of Martin Lindquist, who passed away on March 3rd of this year. Mr. Lindquist was the owner of the property formerly known as the Addison Farm, which he purchased at auction in December of 19... Raymond leaned forward. "Who was he? Why did he buy our farm?" The lawyer held up a hand. "I'll get to that. But first, I need to read the relevant portion of Mr. Lindquist's will." He opened the folder and began to read. "To Raymond Addison and William Addison, the sons of my old friend George, I leave the property known as the Addison Farm, all 480 acres, all buildings, all equipment, to be divided equally between them, according to a plan I have included with this will." Raymond felt the room tilt. "Wait, what? There's more." The lawyer continued reading. "I bought this property in 1978 because I could not bear to see my friend's legacy destroyed by his son's foolishness. George Addison saved my life in 1944, in a place called Anzio, and I swore I would repay that debt someday. I have held this land in trust for 15 years, waiting for Raymond and William to find their way back to each other. I had hoped they would do it while I was alive. Since they have not, I must do it from beyond the grave. The land will be divided as follows. Raymond will receive the south 240 acres, including the farmhouse, as he originally wanted. William will receive the north 80 acres surrounding the equipment barn, plus all the equipment and tools, as he originally wanted. The remaining 160 acres in the center will be held in common, to be farmed jointly by both brothers or their heirs in perpetuity. I ask only one thing in return, that Raymond and William forgive each other for the 15 years they have lost. Those years cannot be returned, but the years ahead need not be wasted in the same way. I was never able to repay George Addison for saving my life. Perhaps by saving his land and his family, I have come close. Your friend always, Martin Lindquist." The lawyer set down the paper. The room was completely silent. Raymond was staring at the wall, his mind trying to process what he'd just heard. The stranger, the man who had bought their farm for a fraction of its value, who had held it for 15 years, was someone their father had saved in the war, someone who had been waiting all this time for the brothers to make peace. William was the first to speak. His voice cracked. "He knew Dad? From the war?" The lawyer nodded. "There's additional documentation in the file. Letters between your father and Mr. Lindquist, dating back to photographs. Mr. Lindquist visited your father several times in the 1950s and 60s, though your father asked him to be discreet. Apparently, he didn't want anyone to know about the incident at Anzio." "What incident?" Raymond asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Your father never told you?" "Never told us what?" The lawyer pulled out another document, old, yellowed military letterhead. "In February of 1944, during the Battle of Anzio, your father was part of a patrol that was ambushed by German forces. Private Martin Lindquist was wounded, shot in the leg, unable to walk. Standard protocol was to leave wounded soldiers for the medics, but your father carried Private Lindquist 2 miles through enemy territory to reach the American lines. He was awarded a Bronze Star for the action, though he apparently never spoke of it." Raymond thought about his father, the quiet man who never talked about the war, who changed the subject whenever anyone asked, who had died with secrets nobody knew. "Why didn't he tell us?" William asked. Mr. Lindquist asked him the same question once. According to the letters, your father said, "A man doesn't brag about doing what's right. You just do it and move on." Raymond looked at William for the first time in 15 years, really looked at him, and he saw his brother looking back. Both of them had tears in their eyes. "We destroyed it," Raymond said. "Everything Dad built, everything that man tried to save. We destroyed it because we were too stubborn to—" He couldn't finish. William stood up. He walked the 3 steps to where his brother sat, and for the first time since their father's funeral, he put his hand on Raymond's shoulder. "We didn't destroy it," We just delayed it. The land's still there. The equipment's still there. Dad's friend made sure of that. 15 years, William. We lost 15 years. Then let's not lose any more. Let me tell you what happened next, because this story has an ending. Not a happy one exactly, but a true one. Raymond and William Addison took possession of their father's farm in the spring of 1993, 15 years after they lost it. They divided it exactly as Martin Lindquist had specified. Raymond taking the south, William taking the north, the center held in common. For the first few years it was awkward. 15 years of silence had built walls that couldn't come down overnight. They communicated through notes, through their wives, through awkward conversations at the fence line that divided their properties. But slowly, season by season, they found their way back. Raymond's sons, young men now, not the children they'd been in 1978, came to help with the planting. William taught them how to maintain the equipment, the same way he'd maintained it for their grandfather. The skills that had almost been lost were passed to a new generation. By 1998, the brothers were having Sunday dinner together. By 2000, they were farming the common land as partners, the way their father had always imagined they would. William died in 2008 at the age of 62. Heart attack, just like their father. Raymond found him in the equipment barn, slumped over the engine of that old Farmall 560, the same tractor William had rebuilt 40 years earlier, still running, still doing its job. At the funeral, Raymond gave the eulogy. He talked about their childhood, their father, the war neither of them had understood. He talked about the 15 years they had lost and the 15 years they had found. And he talked about Martin Lindquist, the stranger nobody knew, who had saved their family because their father had saved his life. I've thought a lot about what Mr. Lindquist did, Raymond said, standing at the pulpit of the same church where they'd buried their father and mother, and now his brother. He could have let our farm be sold to anyone. He could have kept it for himself. Instead, he spent a fortune, most of his savings we learned later, to buy it, and he held it for 15 years, waiting for two stubborn fools to come to their senses. Raymond paused, looking out at the congregation, neighbors, friends, family members, who had watched the whole sad story unfold. William and I wasted 15 years fighting over things that didn't matter. We could have divided that land 100 different ways, and any of them would have been better than what we did. But we were too proud, too certain we were right, too convinced that compromising meant losing. He looked at the casket where his brother lay. Martin Lindquist gave us a gift we didn't deserve, a second chance. And because of that gift, I got to know my brother again. I got to work beside him, argue with him, watch his children grow up, see him become the man he was always meant to be. Raymond's voice broke. I don't know if there's a heaven, but if there is, I hope George Addison and Martin Lindquist are up there together, looking down at this farm, seeing that it's still in the family. I hope they know that their sacrifice, the one on the battlefield and the one in the auction house, wasn't wasted. He stepped back from the pulpit. Thank you, William, for forgiving me, for coming home, for teaching my sons what I couldn't teach them myself. I'll see you on the other side, brother. Save me a seat. Let me leave you with this. The Addison farm is still there, still in the family, still producing. Raymond's grandchildren work it now, the 5th generation on land that was almost lost because two brothers couldn't agree. In the equipment barn, there's a wall with 3 photographs. The first shows George Addison in his Army uniform, 1944, young and serious. The second shows Martin Lindquist in civilian clothes, 1960, standing in front of the Addison farmhouse with his old friend. The third shows Raymond and William Addison, 1998, shaking hands in front of the same farmhouse, old men finally at peace. Below the photographs, there's a small plaque with words that Raymond wrote after William's funeral. Some debts take a lifetime to repay. Some grudges take a lifetime to release. But some things, family, land, the bonds between brothers, are worth whatever time it takes to make them right. Don't wait 15 years. Don't let a stranger do what you should do yourself. And never ever forget that the people you're fighting with are the same people you'll need when the fighting is done. The Farmall 560 that William loved is still in the barn. Raymond's grandson restored it a few years ago, the same way William restored it 40 years before. It runs perfectly, better than the day it left the factory. Some things, if you're patient enough, can be saved. Some things, if you're stubborn enough, cannot. The difference is knowing which is which, and having the courage to act before it's too late.